I proposed to a woman who had already buried her mother twice. Once in the story she told me, once in the house I found her living in, 40 minutes away, still breathing. I told myself I was a man who knew how to read people. 63 years will do that to you, or at least make you believe it does. That was my flaw, and I'll give it to you right now so you don't have to wait for it to surface on its own. I stopped asking hard questions because I thought I already knew the soft answers. I was wrong in a way that took me 14 months to understand, and I want you to understand it faster than I did. My name is Walter Odom. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working maintenance and facilities management for the county school district in Hargrove, Tennessee, and I retired 2 years ahead of schedule when my knees finally filed the paperwork before I did. I have a son, Marcus, 29, who lives in Knoxville with his wife and their 2-year-old. My first marriage ended when Marcus was 11, and I won't spend time here explaining it except to say that his mother and I split the holidays and never once made that boy feel like a boundary line. I know what it looks like when adults decide to put a child ahead of their own grievance. I thought that made me a fair judge of character. Turns out it made me overconfident. I met Carol Sykes at a hardware store on a Saturday in late February. She was standing in the paint aisle holding 2 sample cards up against the wall display, and I made a comment about neither one of them being right for whatever she was trying to do. She turned around and told me, without missing a beat, that she hadn't asked. And then she laughed. And that was that. Carol was 58. She'd been widowed 6 years earlier when her husband, from what she told me, passed from complications after a surgery that should have been routine. She had a calm about her that I mistook for peace, the kind of stillness a person carries when they've already processed everything there is to process and come out the other side settled. She spoke quietly in most situations. She was unhurried. She never raised her voice in any conversation I witnessed over the following year, and I was around her enough that I should have seen at least one crack. I didn't, and I should have understood that a person without cracks is either exceptionally whole or exceptionally careful. She was good with people. Genuinely good, the kind you can't perform. She remembered names. She asked follow-up questions a week after you first mentioned something. She brought food to neighbors she barely knew when she heard they were having a hard time. When the woman across the street from her lost her dog, Carol spent 2 afternoons helping her paper the neighborhood with flyers. The dog was found. Carol cried when she heard about it. I watched her. It was real. I bring all of this up because it matters to what comes next. It's easy to explain away a betrayal when the person was always a little cold, a little distant, a little wrong. Carol was none of those things in any direction I could see. Which is why, for over a year, I let one door stay closed without ever asking what was behind it. The first time I asked about her family, she told me her parents were gone. She said it simply, without emotion, the way you say a fact about weather. I lost both of them, she said. It's just me now. I said I was sorry. She shook her head and said there wasn't anything to be sorry about, that it had been a long time, and that she'd made her peace with being the last one standing in her branch of the family. I believed her completely. I had no reason not to. We got engaged the following January, at a small restaurant in downtown Hargrove, the kind of place with tablecloths and a piano player on weekends. I gave her my grandmother's ring, a simple oval sapphire in a silver setting, and she held it up to the candlelight for a long moment before she put it on. She said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. I think she meant it. Wedding planning started in the spring. We agreed on something small, 40 people at most, held at a lodge about 20 miles outside of town that did events on weekends. Carol took the lead on most of the vendor coordination. She said she had a background in event planning from a job she'd held years before, and she handled the logistics with an ease that made me trust her with it completely. I wrote the checks she asked for. I didn't scrutinize the invoices. I was working part-time consulting for 2 school districts in the area, and spending the rest of my energy getting the house I'd owned for 12 years ready to either sell or share, depending on what Carol and I decided after the wedding. There were 3 things I didn't pay enough attention to. I know that now with the clarity that only comes after. The first was in April, when I asked if she'd be inviting anyone from her side of the family. She said no, that her parents were gone and she had no siblings, and that the few cousins she'd been close to had drifted years ago. She said it without sadness and without defensiveness. Just the same quiet fact. I nodded and moved on. The second was in June. We were filling out a form for the venue's guest coordinator, and there was a line for emergency contacts. Carol paused for a longer moment than made sense for someone who had no family, then wrote down the name of a coworker. I noticed the pause. I filed it somewhere I didn't look at again. The third was a piece of mail. Late July, a Tuesday. I had stopped by Carol's house to drop off some paperwork from the florist, and a piece of mail on her kitchen counter caught my eye. The way something does when your brain registers a detail before your conscious mind processes why. The return address said Millsfield Care and Rehabilitation. Millsfield was a town about 35 miles north of Hargrove. I didn't pick up the envelope. I didn't ask about it. Carol came in from the back room. I handed her the florist folder, and we talked about centerpieces for an hour. I did not mention the envelope. I've thought about that moment more than almost any other. The thing that changed everything came from my son. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening in early September, about 6 weeks before the wedding. He was calling to tell me he and his wife were planning to drive down for the weekend to help me move some furniture, and we were talking about logistics when he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd had a strange experience the week before. He'd been in Millsfield for a work conference, and he'd stopped into a diner for lunch, and the woman at the next table had recognized his last name. She asked if I was related to Walter Odom from Hargrove, he said. She knew your name, Dad. Said she'd heard Carol mention it. I didn't know what to say, so I just kind of confirmed it. I asked him what the woman wanted. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "She asked if you knew about Beverly and Roy." I told him I didn't know anyone by those names. Another pause. "Dad," he said, "she said they were Carol's parents." I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time after that call ended. I want to be precise about what I felt, because it wasn't rage, not at first. It was the particular vertigo of realizing that a foundation you'd been standing on for over a year had been plywood over a hole the whole time. The ground hadn't moved. It had never been ground. I didn't say anything to Carol that night. I didn't say anything for 3 days. What I did instead was make a phone call. The woman from the diner was named Trudy Callahan. Marcus had gotten her number and texted it to me without me having to ask, because my son is sharper than I give him credit for. I called Trudy on a Thursday morning. She'd worked as a volunteer visitor at Millsfield Care and Rehabilitation for 4 years, going in twice a week to sit with residents who didn't get many guests. Beverly and Roy Sykes were 2 of her regulars. Beverly was 79. Roy was 81. He had moderate to advanced dementia and hadn't recognized his daughter reliably in about 2 years, according to Trudy. Beverly was physically frail but mentally clear. Clear enough to have talked about her daughter to Trudy every week for 4 years. Clear enough to have mentioned, in recent months, that her daughter was getting married to a man named Walter from Hargrove. Beverly talks about Carol all the time, Trudy told me. She loves her. She asks for her. She has a photo of her on her nightstand, and she shows it to everybody who comes in the room. She paused. Carol visits maybe once every 2 months. She usually comes alone, and she doesn't stay long. I've only seen her twice in 4 years. I thanked Trudy and sat with what she'd told me. The sapphire ring I'd given Carol had belonged to my grandmother. I'd carried it for 6 years after my grandmother passed, waiting for a moment worthy of it. I want you to hold on to that detail. It comes back. I drove to Millsfield on a Saturday morning. Alone. I didn't tell Carol where I was going. I told myself I was making sure I had the full picture before I did anything. And that was partly true. The other part was that I needed to see it with my own eyes before I let myself believe it. Millsfield Care and Rehabilitation was a single-story building on a road lined with old oaks that had made the pavement buckle over the years. It looked well-maintained but tired, the way places look when the people running them are doing their best with what they have. I went to the front desk and said I was there to visit Beverly and Roy Sykes, that I was the fiancé of their daughter. The woman at the desk looked up at me with an expression I had seen once before, on a different face in a different context, and I recognized it immediately. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for this conversation to happen. She called a nurse named Denise, who walked me back. Beverly Sykes was sitting in a chair by the window with a blanket across her lap and a paperback book open on the arm of the chair. She was small, white-haired, and when she looked up at me, she had Carol's eyes exactly the same color, the same quality of stillness. I introduced myself. I said I was Walter, that I was engaged to her daughter. Beverly closed her book. She reached out and took my hand in both of hers, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Then she said, "She told us about you. She said you were kind." I did not know how to respond to that. I said I'd wanted to meet her and Roy before the wedding, and that I was sorry it had taken so long. Beverly smiled in a way that was patient and a little sad. She said, "She always says soon. She's been saying soon since Roy's diagnosis." She squeezed my hand once and let go. "Roy's asleep right now. His good hours are in the morning. Come back in the morning if you can." I asked if I could ask her something direct. She said yes. I asked if Carol had power of attorney over their finances. The pause that followed was exactly as long as it needed to be. Beverly said yes. That Carol had set it up 2 years ago, after Roy's diagnosis made it clear that someone needed to be managing things. She said Carol handled their billing, their insurance, the monthly payments to the facility. She said she trusted Carol with it. She said she didn't have anyone else. I asked her to describe what the monthly payments looked like, whether she ever saw the statements. Beverly said Carol handled all of that. She said she'd signed some things. She said she got a summary sometimes, but didn't always understand the numbers. She said she trusted Carol. I drove home slower than I drove out. The following Monday, I called a woman named Patricia Home, an elder law attorney in Hargrove, who had handled an estate dispute for my neighbor 2 years back. I told her everything. She was quiet through most of it and asked 3 questions at the end. Then she told me what I needed to do. On Wednesday, Patricia came with me to Millsfield. We met with Beverly in the morning, when Roy was having one of his clearer stretches, sitting up in bed and holding Beverly's hand, without quite knowing who she was, but seeming to find the holding comforting regardless. Patricia walked Beverly through her rights gently, thoroughly, without any urgency in her voice. Beverly listened. She asked 2 questions. Then she said, "I want to understand what's been going out of the account." What Patricia had requested and received, with Beverly's verbal authorization, were 6 months of bank statements on the account Carol managed. The catering deposit for our wedding was on there. The venue deposit. 2 payments I recognized as florist fees. A charge to a stationery company that matched the timeline of our invitations being ordered. $1,200 paid to a rental company for chairs and linens. Beverly and Roy Sykes, in a care facility 35 miles away, had been quietly funding a wedding they were told they would not be attending, from an account they believed was being used for their care and their comfort. Beverly looked at the statements for a long time. Then she said, "I thought the facility had raised their rates." I stayed in that room for another hour. Roy fell asleep again. Beverly asked me about my son. She asked about my work. She asked what my grandmother had been like. And I realized Carol must have told her about the ring, which meant Carol had talked about me far more than she had ever led me to believe. I don't know what to do with that. I still don't. Patricia revoked Carol's power of attorney that week. Beverly appointed a professional fiduciary in Millsfield, a man named Douglas who worked with 6 other families in the facility and who agreed to take them on. Trudy Callahan, the volunteer visitor who had started all of this with one sentence to my son at a diner, agreed to be Beverly's listed emergency contact. I did not tell Carol any of this while it was happening. What I watched instead, over the following 2 weeks, was the slow arrival of confusion on her end. The facility called her about a billing irregularity. The venue called her about a payment that had been declined. She sent me 3 texts asking about the wedding timeline. Casual texts, the kind you send when you're rearranging, not panicking. Then 5 texts. Then she called. I let it go to voicemail. I was not hiding. I was simply finished performing normalcy while I figured out what I was going to say. She came to my house on a Thursday evening. I'd been expecting her. I opened the door and let her in, and I didn't offer her anything to sit down with, and I didn't ask her how she was. I said, I've been to Millsfield. I met your parents. I know what the account statements say. Carol stood in my hallway and didn't move. Not toward me. Not toward the door. She was utterly still in the way she had always been. Utterly still. Except this time, I could see it for what it was. Not peace. Management. She said, "How did you find out?" I told her. Marcus, the diner, Trudy. The piece of mail I'd seen on her counter in July and hadn't asked about. All of it. She didn't deny a single thing. She said, "You don't understand what it's been like, managing them from a distance, the facility, the insurance, all of it. I needed to make sure the bills were covered." I told her I'd seen the statements. I told her I knew which bills had actually been covered. She said, "The wedding was going to be my fresh start." I said, "It was going to be built on their retirement." She didn't respond to that. She looked at my hands for a moment, at where my grandmother's ring was not, because I wasn't wearing it. I'd stopped wearing the band I'd bought for myself the week before, and I think she noticed. She looked at the wall. She said, "I was going to pay it back." I told her I believed she'd told herself that. I told her that I didn't think it made the thing she'd done smaller. I told her that Beverly had held my hand and said my name and asked about my grandmother, and that Roy had held Beverly's hand without knowing why, and that none of that had happened in front of Carol in years. I didn't raise my voice. There was nothing in me that wanted to. The part of me that might have wanted to shout had already gone quiet somewhere on the drive back from Millsfield that first Saturday. What was left was just clarity, the kind that doesn't need volume. Carol left. I closed the door. I called the venue the next morning and canceled the booking. I recovered part of the deposit. The rest I let go. I didn't pursue Carol legally for the wedding costs. Patricia told me I had grounds to. I thought about it for approximately 1 day, and then decided that I didn't want to spend 1 more hour of my life calculating what I was owed by a woman who had already calculated her parents down to a line item. Before I did anything else, I drove back to Carol's house one final time. She wasn't there. I put the envelope in her mailbox. Inside it was my grandmother's ring. It was not my ring to keep. It had never been my ring to give. It belonged to a woman who was gone, and if I couldn't give it to the person I'd intended, then I needed it back in a drawer where my son could decide someday what to do with it. She left it on my porch the next morning. I went back to Millsfield the following Sunday. I sat with Beverly for 2 hours. She was having a hard week. Roy had been agitated and she'd slept poorly, and she seemed grateful just to have someone in the room who wasn't staff. I brought a thermos of the kind of coffee she'd told me she liked, and we talked about Roy when he was young, about the town in Kentucky where they'd both grown up, about a dog they'd had in the 80s that Beverly said was the smartest animal she'd ever known. She laughed, telling me about the dog. I laughed too. Marcus drove down with his wife and the baby the following weekend. I hadn't told him everything on the phone, and I sat him down on the back porch and told him all of it. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What are you going to do now?" I told him I was going to keep showing up in Millsfield on Sundays. He looked at me for a second, and then he just nodded. He understood it the way kids understand things when they've watched you handle the hard parts their whole lives. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knows I know what to do with hard things. What he did instead was ask if he could come with me the next Sunday, and I said yes, and he did. Roy passed in November, on a Tuesday morning, the kind of quiet morning that seems selected for those departures. Denise called me. Beverly had asked her to put me on the contact list 2 months earlier, and I was the one who called Marcus, and we drove out there together. Beverly was sitting with Roy when we arrived, holding the same hand she'd been holding when I'd first walked into that room. She looked up when we came in and she said, "He waited until it was light." I don't know if Carol knows. I have no way of knowing, and I stopped trying to track what she knows or doesn't know some time ago. I still go on Sundays. Beverly is smaller than when I first met her, and she gets tired faster. And some weeks we don't talk much, we just sit. She's gotten to know Marcus's baby on video calls, and she refers to that baby by name now every time I come. She has a photograph on her nightstand that was not there the first time I visited. She put it there in December. It is a photograph of Marcus's family, printed from his phone. In a small frame, Beverly asked one of the nurses to help her pick out from an online shop. There are things I've thought about a lot in the months since all of this. I think about the June evening when I sat across from Carol at the diner near the interstate and she described her parents in the past tense, careful and unbothered, and I thought I was hearing grief. I think about the mail on her counter and the pause before she wrote the coworker's name on the emergency contact form. I think about all the meals she brought to neighbors, all the afternoons she gave to other people's problems, all the genuine warmth she showed to everyone in a 50-foot radius, except the 2 people in a care facility 35 miles north of her who had a photograph of her on a nightstand and told a stranger about her every week. I think that's the thing I'll be sitting with the longest, not the money, not the wedding, not the year I gave to someone who was already gone in the ways that mattered. The thing I'll sit with is the gap between who Carol was in public and who she was in private, and how long and how thoroughly she had filled that gap with other people's needs, so that no one, including probably herself, had to look directly at what she was doing to her own. I don't know if Carol has ever gone back to Millsfield. I know that Beverly hasn't asked me about her in several months now. At first, Beverly would bring her up, "Did Carol say anything?" Or, "Do you think Carol is all right?" And I would answer honestly that I didn't know, and Beverly would nod and look out the window. But she stopped asking sometime around February. I don't read anything into that. A person can only hold so many open doors before they start to let some of them close. The Sunday before last, Beverly told me something while we were sitting by the window with our coffee. She said, "Roy used to say the only people worth trusting are the ones who show up when there's nothing in it for them." She said it lightly, the way you say something you've been carrying for a long time that has finally gotten lighter. I think he would have liked you, Walter. That's all I needed to hear. I didn't need an apology from Carol. I didn't need a reckoning, a court date, a moment of dramatic acknowledgement. I needed to know that I had done the right thing with the time I had, and that the right thing had been useful to someone who needed it. If you're watching this tonight, and you've ever ignored a piece of mail on a counter, or accepted an answer about someone's family that didn't quite sit right, or told yourself that trust was the same thing as not looking, I want you to know that I'm not judging you. I was there for 14 months. All I'm saying is, ask the question. It costs you one conversation. Not asking can cost someone everything. I'm Walter. I'm 63. I bring coffee to a woman in Millsfield on Sundays. And some weeks her memory of Roy is sharp enough that she tells a new story about him. And some weeks it isn't. And either way, I'm there. That's the whole of it. That's enough. If any part of this hit home for you tonight, if you've ever discovered a truth too late, or chosen to show up for someone even when it wasn't your job, leave it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what you're thinking about. I read every one of them. This is Walter, and I'll see you in the next one.